going to introduce you one by one. So, as I'm sure you all know, he's the author of 10 beautiful novels, including the book of shortlisted Paradise, the book of longlisted By the Sea, and his most recent novel, Afterlives. And of course, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2021. I'm going to mention where everybody originates from, where they live, because I think this is interesting in terms of the discussion we're going to be having. So Abdulrazak was born and brought up in Zanzibar and has been living in the UK since he was 18 years old. I'm going to skip Louise and go on to Damon next. Damon Galgut is a South African playwright, short story writer, novelist, author of 9 novels, including his first novel, A Sinless Season, which was written when he was only 17 years old. Can you imagine? He's been 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which is almost disgusting. The Good Doctor was shortlisted and winner at the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, as was In a Strange Room, and most recently The Promise, which won the 2021 Booker Prize.
All right.
So back one, Louise Kennedy is a Northern Irish author of a collection of stories, The End of the World as a Cul-de-sac, and a debut novel, Trespasses, a really wonderful novel which won the Irish Novel of the Year. But she has started writing relatively late in life compared to Damon, because she spent 30 years working as a chef in London and Beirut. So next to Damon is Nadifa Muhammed, who was born in Somalia and moved to Britain as a child. She's the author of 3 incredibly acclaimed novels, like Mamba Boy, which won, I mean, it's insane for a first novel, a Betty Trask Prize. She was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book, the John Llewellyn Rhys and the Dylan Thomas Prizes. Her second novel is The Orchard of Lost Souls, and her third, A Fortune Man, was shortlisted for the Costa Best Novel and for the Booker Prize. And she was made a grant of Best of Young British Writer. And I'm also just going to quote something that Kamala Shamsi said about her work. Kamala is a writer I've worked with for nearly 30 years, and I listen to her carefully. But I feel not just about Nadifa's work, because I feel this applies to the work of all these 4 novelists together. So she says about her, a writer of great humanity and intelligence, Nadifa Muhammed deeply understands how lives are shaped, both by the grand sweep of history and the intimate encounters of human beings. And I feel this is much of what we'll talk about today. But to turn from fiction, we have what I would say is the grit in the oyster of fiction, who is an incredibly distinguished writer of non-fiction, Rashid, Ahmed. Rashid. And he is a journalist who has been for 20 years the Daily Telegraph correspondent. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, The Nation, Daily Times here. He appears regularly on television. But amongst his many very distinguished books was his book Taliban, which he told me the other night no publisher wanted to take because who was interested in the Taliban? And then a very small press in Britain took it on, and guess what, 9/11 happened. And it has sold over 2 million copies around the world and is the great work on the subject. So Ahmed, I want to start with you. And I want to start with you because I want to know what you feel about fiction, and do you read it, and why?
I'm deeply envious of all you fiction writers, all the people on the stage. Once you start writing non-fiction, I found it impossible, incredibly difficult, to also write fiction. I've tried very hard, but I failed, basically. So maybe I need to go back to school But the fact is that we, when we are children, we grow up with stories. And fiction has an incredible lure for any writer, because if he can tell a good story, I mean, he's won the battle of success in writing. Non-fiction is a much more tricky proposition. You have to research it, work it, and there are many ifs and buts before you can get the book out. Fiction is such a beautiful, luminous kind of writing, basically, if you're good at it. You can win somebody's heart by just writing the first page of a novel, or reading the first page of a novel. So I think, fiction is the cat's whiskers, the be-all and end-all of all writing. And the stories that fiction tells are extraordinary.
And you are a poet, are you not? And you just published a collection of poetry.
Well, I started out as a poet, and I hope that would lead to becoming a dramatist, and that would lead to becoming a fiction writer. And none of that worked. Instead, I became a non-fiction writer. I think it's very difficult for people, for somebody with limited brain like myself, to actually be able to write a non-fiction book and then to suddenly switch to fiction. It's an incredibly difficult way, unless you've got the two different sides in your brain already.
And Nadifa, you trained as a historian, didn't you?
I studied history and politics at university and thought I would go into diplomacy, but I'm not very diplomatic. And I quickly fell into script writing. That was my introduction to fiction writing, was script writing, which is very different in many ways. And literature feels a more natural home. I've always been a big reader, but I didn't know how to translate reading into writing. But it was my father's story that really gave me the motivation to be able to write something down of my own, and it was my father's life story that was that.
But were you interested, did you set out to write it as a memoir or non-fiction?
I started off writing about my father's life as a biography,
Yeah.
and he was right there telling me exactly how things happened, the whys and hows, but what was lacking and what I needed in writing his story was the emotional and psychological landscape. And that's something, because of the trauma of the experiences he'd had as a street boy in Aden, as a child soldier in Eritrea during the Second World War, I think either in the moment itself, he couldn't think about his experiences, or afterwards he just kind of wiped them away from his mind or suppressed them. And I couldn't write without thinking about his emotional and psychological state. And that's where the fiction came in.
So you needed fiction in order to explore it to the furthest way.
In a way that
you
made
could.
it seem real to me.
Yeah. And then your third novel is also based on a real person.
Yes. So it's very much a counterpoint to my first novel. They're related. They're, the younger brother and the older brother, and the Fortune Man picks up just a few years after Black Mamba Boy ends in 1940s, 50s Britain, in the world of Somali sailors in these dock towns. And that one, I had the experience of what it was like to research, and I didn't have the person there in front of me like I had with my father, so the archives really paid off for me. And the fact that Mahmoud's case file was available, and it shouldn't have been. Normally you have to wait 70 years before the case file is opened, but someone had forced them to release it early. And having many historical documents in front of you made me think back to the training I'd had as a historian, because it's so convincing when you see things stamped February 1952. It makes you feel like this is the reality, this is the truth. But I had to keep reminding myself that all of these documents are a fiction of their own. The police created a fiction around this man to frame him for a murder he did not commit. So I'm writing what is formally fiction, but using what is bureaucratic fiction in that process.
And I'm not going to ask Abdulrazak, and because novels, except I think your historical novels, you just think these are novels, but Paradise and Afterlives are taking real and very important events. And how much was that your motivation to write those to do with that sense of history and the importance of it?
Yeah, Paradise first, because that came out of part of the impulse anyway was trying to imagine what somebody like my father, somebody of his age, I mean, that he would have been a child at the moment when Zanzibar anyway became a British colony, because it was quite late in the 19th century when that happened. So I was trying to imagine that encounter, and also thinking other associated questions, of course, as well, like how was it that it succeeded so apparently easily? What was it that was there that made it possible for European power to establish itself, as I thought at the time, relatively effortlessly? I didn't really know the full story, as most people actually didn't seem to know the full story. I only discovered, or rather learned, the full story and the extent of the devastation that conflict caused much later, which then became the subject of the novel Afterlives, although that wasn't the only subject. So when I started to write Paradise, it was to write about the war, about that conflict, rather, I should say, because it wasn't really a war that made any sense to the people in whose land, as it were, was taking place. They certainly didn't know that this was a kind of like the final act of the scramble for Africa. They didn't know that this was about sharing out the territory amongst European nations and all of that. What they went through, what they saw, was not a war, but a conflict going on that made no sense. Unfortunately, most of the participants in this conflict were actually Africans, mercenaries on one side or the other, which then brings in an enormously ironic dimension to this whole episode. Anyway, so there are so many things there to investigate and to think about, and I'm glad I got around to doing it, in short.
You said the other day in another session that one of the things that fiction can do is bring people to a piece of history, a series of events that they maybe wouldn't, unless they were specialists, read in a history book.
Yeah, that was also, I mean, I wasn't setting out to say I'm going to write a novel to bridge with historical knowledge, but I think that is one of the things that does happen, that it isn't this episode that I'm talking about, it isn't that episode is unknown to scholars of, say, the history of the First World War. It's just that it isn't there in the popular knowledge of the events of that war. And there are reasons for this. I mean, more often than not, particularly in Europe, when people think about the 1914-18 war, they think about the horrors of the trenches, and because so many people, every village probably lost, every town, every street probably lost somebody. But it's not called World War for nothing, because these conflicts are also taking place in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Africa, and that seemed to be the least known about. So it wasn't my intention to say, hey, you don't know about this. I wanted to write about it because, in a sense, I did know about it, and it didn't seem to be something known about. And what can be more tempting for a writer than something like that, to go and say, people don't know about this, let me tell them about it. Something of that kind. But then you find that really everywhere the book has been read, people say, I didn't know about this. In Germany, in Britain, and elsewhere. I guess it's more forgivable for people in Argentina not to have known about it. I find it less forgivable that people in Britain didn't know about the extent of the devastation their activities caused across the world, or indeed in Germany.
So this, I think, brings us onto the subject of conflict, and both Louise and Damon come out of countries where conflict has been every breathing bit of their lives. And so Louise, I think it's very interesting. For years, I think certainly in Britain, people didn't really want to read fiction about the Troubles. It was too close, and it's really heartening that I feel there's a real sea change. And in fact, when Irish writers wanted to address that subject, I think they very often had to do it in a subverted way through other histories. For example, Ronan Bennett's novel The Catastrophists, that is set in the Congo, but in many ways is also about Ireland.
Yeah, I would consider that to be a troubled novel, even though it's not set, even though it's very much on it.
Yeah. So, but you have set your novel, and you were 8 at the time in 1975, and you talked yesterday about how you saw an exhibition and how that brought the novel about. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so in 2014, it was really the first time anyone was brave enough to bring together, all through the Troubles from the 70s, people were making art, but nobody until 2014 actually brought it all together and called the exhibition The Art of the Troubles, and it was in the Ulster Museum, and there were all sorts of things. There was photography, there were films and pieces of sculpture. But I think that maybe seeing all of that stuff together, and because at that stage it was less than 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement, but it was controversial. There hasn't been a very satisfactory kind of judicial process connected with Troubles deaths. So there was sort of state violence that hasn't really been addressed. Lots of the other murders were unsolved, so a lot of people are still carrying a lot of pain and anger, and so that was actually kind of a controversial thing to do, to bring all of this stuff together. But I think it maybe made me think about how visual art can be used to say things in a place where language is very difficult, not just the Irish language versus the English language thing, which is still an issue. It's just very recently been resolved, not by the Northern Ireland Executive, but Westminster, which is kind of ironic. But also just even in what things are called, the Good Friday Agreement, the DUP called that the Belfast Agreement. Even to call the place Northern Ireland is a very loaded term, that some people prefer to call it the North of Ireland. So, all of that.
And of course, your own childhood, your grandmother, wasn't she injured in a bombing, and your grandfather had a car that had 2 bombing attempts. Yeah. So this must have informed every breathing moment of your life in some way.
Yeah, it did. But also there were things that were extremely normal. We lived in a bungalow on a street full of children, and we played outside on our bikes, and we walked up to the pops every weekend. We were very interested in music and things. But also there were maybe records that my parents had in the house that were sort of Irish ballads records, that were kept in a drawer, and we were warned for, not to let any of our Protestant friends see these records in case it made us look like raving Republicans. So I think it was just maybe because of the demographic of the town that we lived in, that we had to behave in a certain way because we were very much in the minority, and I think possibly we're seen as upstart by a lot of our neighbours.
Yeah. And I love it when you said once, I didn't set out to write a book about the Troubles. I set about to write a love story, but I couldn't set it in that year without the Troubles coming into it. And I think it's very important when you talk about novels that are steeped in politics and history, that it's so much more than that, because it's about people's intimate lives, and that's what draws you in. And your novel, The Love Story, at the centre of it. It's so moving. And of course, it's a love story between 2 different religions, isn't it? Yeah. So Damon, tell us a bit about what the politics of South Africa have meant to you. You're very interesting about that.
What the politics have meant to me?
Yes, as in how it's affected you as a writer, and how you find that it's there, even if it's not in the foreground.
mention my first novel, The Sinless Season, which is not a book I'm very proud of now. None of us are proud of our adolescent scribblings, I think. I would have preferred to kick off with my second book, which dealt with an episode that's very personal to me. I was extremely ill as a child, and the illness, for various reasons, broke up my family. And I wrote about this when I was in my mid-20s. A story that I really, really cared about, and that, I felt spoke for me. And I was really startled by some of the reactions I got from reviewers in the UK, who essentially said, who is this spoiled white boy who thinks his own troubles are more important than the troubles of his country? I mean, South Africa was burning at that point. I was not a very politically aware young person. I mean, generally, it's people who are at the receiving end of an unjust system who tend to be highly politicized. The oppressors have the luxury of ignoring the politics, and of course I was born into privilege by virtue of my skin. So in a sense, that was my first awareness, not of the kind of country I was living in, but of the obligation to face up to it on a literary stage. And since then, I've more or less consciously tried to take the larger picture into account. But, the term political novel is a very off-putting one to me. It has a clunky, mechanical
But
feel.
I think all of you would agree with that. I don't think any of you as writers have set out to write political novels. But it's really, the interesting thing is that how politics weaves itself somehow, gently and very much in the background. But you said just literally the other day, it's almost impossible to write about South Africa without politics and history being characters.
I mean, I think that's true. In the session this morning, in response to something that came up, I said, if you're going to think of a character, you may want to write an absolutely apolitical story, a love story, let's say. But if you create a character in South Africa, you cannot ignore their race, their class, their lineage, what their parents may have done. I mean, you absolutely have to take these things into account. And I mean, maybe it is heightened in South Africa, excuse me, more than it would be elsewhere. But these are things that shape all of us. All of us are shaped by our societies and our history. And some of us have the luxury of ignoring how that shape may have come about. But in South Africa, that luxury is not available. But I still believe novels are about people and what constitutes human lives. While politics is very fundamental to it, it is also only one element. There are other very important aspects of being human that in fact novels can illuminate far better than maybe non-fiction can. Non-fiction can tell you how history unfolds, but novels can tell you how it feels to be a human at a certain point in history. That's the best way I can put it, I think.
And this is surely why we need fiction as a chronicler of our times, in that it is our way to feel life and to feel history, isn't it? Rather than being told it, perhaps. But the other thing that you said I thought was very interesting was that you said as a South African writer you grew up with a sense of being at the edge of things, and I wonder how much for all of you that's part of who you are, whether it's to do with what's happening in your country or whether it's to do with displacement from your country. So Nadifa, what do you feel about that?
Absolutely. I think most writers have some sort of feeling of being outsiders for one reason or another. For me, being born in one country, leaving that behind, and then it sort of disappearing. It was impossible to visit Somalia for at least a decade. And when it reappeared for me as a child, it was suddenly on the news in this horrible conflict with lots of suffering. So I think that jarring sense of reality, or a reality beyond your own control, makes you very keenly aware of everything, of power relationships. And you don't think of them as power relationships when you're a child. You slowly absorb society's assumptions and hierarchies, and then as you get older you start to challenge them and think about them in a deeper way. So I think it is a commonplace positionality of looking from the outside into something for many novelists.
And Abdulrazak, what about you?
I think I certainly felt out of the edge, as it were, when I was first in the United Kingdom. But I think this wasn't a kind of like a singular feeling, or an all-powerful feeling, because alongside it was also another feeling of being part of something bigger. One of many, rather than alone. So I think both of those were present and have been present, and I guess insofar as writing is concerned, that sense of being one of many has grown for me rather than diminished. So of course the task itself is pretty much you're out on your own, and even some of the things that seem to come out when you're sitting down at a desk, unanticipated sometimes, are also sometimes surprisingly out of their own, and you think, okay, I'll go along with it, you know. So in that respect, the process, the writing process itself, I think, is one in which you almost dare yourself to be going further and further than you thought it was possible to go. But at the same time, I think the kind of human landscape, as it were, that I want to portray or to depict is one where people do recognize and do connect and do, like I said, are one of many rather than isolated people. So it's both things. It's both the sense of the exercise itself is a kind of a marginalizing one. You're thinking on your own, sometimes you're taking risks, sometimes you think you might offend. In fact, quite a lot of the time, there's a slight fear that this might offend, but nonetheless, you're not going to go for it. But the world itself that I'm thinking of, I'm not thinking of as a world full of isolated people, but of people who do find ways, ultimately at least, to connect.
And Ahmed, I'm very interested in your life, because didn't your life, your early life, was to do with actual political engagement, and then you went from that into writing. Tell us a little bit about your journey into becoming a writer.
I started writing at a very young age. I mean, some of my earliest poems I wrote when I was 9 or 10 years old. And I think there was a great desire for me to evoke people and to create emotion in people, even at that very young age, through my poetry, and then through prose, and I was writing film scripts which never got made, and even plays which never got held. But I think, you know, what drove me so much was the conditions of people's lives around me, which was pretty desperate for a very long time. And then also that I wanted to evoke emotions in people and sympathy and love and all the good work and all the big work. And I thought the best way to do this would be through writing. And my first serious publication was a guerrilla newspaper, which was issued for several years, which I bought out myself, clandestinely. And the idea that you can you could write poetry, you could write non-fiction, fiction, and then also write very political words and essays. It's something that was very unusual when I was young, but now it's become the norm. I mean, I can't imagine half a dozen countries, including Northern Ireland and countries in Africa and my own country, of being able to write a book which does not mention conflict, poverty, hatred, etc. All those factors are there. And it's unfortunate, but I can't imagine anyone now sitting down and writing a novel like Dostoevsky, for example, or War and Peace, or a novel about conflict which gives you enormous satisfaction in being able to read it and understand it in a context that is not violent and abusive and fearful. So it's a long way to go, but I'm very, very anxiously waiting for the boom in my head so that I can start writing a novel. And as I said, I'm just extremely envious of those who can write both fiction and non-fiction. There are a few people who've done it, and they've done a very good job. But it's a very difficult thing to do.
It is, and of course we all begin as readers, don't we? And that's how it all starts.
And we all begin as storytellers. We want to hear stories and we want to tell stories. And for example, my poetry is all about stories. There are no clever gimmicks in the language of my poetry. I tell stories of what I've heard, what I've seen around me. And of course, we grow up with stories and they never leave us. And it's just a question of how you want to use them. Do you use them to improve your business acumen, or do you use them for other people to read about?
Thank you. I think it would be lovely to have questions from the audience. If you have questions, do we have a microphone? Okay, we have a microphone. If you want to put your hands up, I saw one and then it disappeared. Okay, there's one up on that side. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm actually a lecturer at the Department of Poetry. I have just a question regarding this fiction writing. At some point in time, I was reading Shafak, and she put it in a way that, writing is a kind of a godlike, it's the God's way of communication. It's like a very godlike feeling, where you give birth to reality and then, you take the life out of that reality. My question is, it's a very general question. While you are writing, and this is a very self-reflexive question as well, while you are writing, and yet when you are glorifying a particular aspect of reality, do you feel this pressure that, perhaps you are putting one aspect of reality as glorified and you are pushing the other spectrum of the reality to the wall? Or do you feel this pressure of epistemic violence, which sometimes we call, for example, let's suppose you are explaining someone's reality and maybe you are not doing justice to it. You are kind of, patronizing the reality of someone. This is a question, this is an open question if someone can answer this. On the inside, do you feel this pressure as a writer?
And are you talking about somebody writing about a real person? Is that what you mean?
Yes, for example, let's suppose you are talking about particular reality, or maybe you are trying to highlight a particular aspect of the reality. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Nadifa, because you've actually written about a real person.
I have, and I'm thinking hard about your question, and there's two aspects to it, and one is that power you have to control how you present something, how you represent something, and that is something you do have to think about very carefully, because it might be the only book that people read set in that time and place. So whatever you say could be seen as a factual commentary on those people. And the other part of the question, I guess, is exploitation within your writing, or simply getting it wrong. You know, if you're writing about someone who's living on the streets, if you've never experienced that, I think it's a very, very different way of experiencing reality. And, you know, with me, when I was writing about my father, he'd experienced things that I've been lucky to, and he made sure that I never experienced for myself. And there was this tension there between what I could believe, what I wanted to believe, what he had allowed himself to forget, what he wanted to tell me, what he didn't want to tell me. And I think there's no neat way of bringing all of those things together. You make choices, you try and not patronize and not exploit, but at the end of the day, I think you all present their world as you see it.
Thank you. There's a question in the second row.
My question is to Abdulrazak Gurnah. You criticize in your fiction, you have criticized colonialism in your fiction, but the fact is that colonialism brought new technology and science as well here. What do you think?
No, it brought more than that. I mean, I would have thought one of the major benefits was probably the great progress in medical knowledge that came with colonialism as a result. But these are unlooked for benefits. These were not the intention of the whole enterprise. These are the things that we got left with by chance. The roads, the railways, the hospitals, whatever. That wasn't the point. The point was to come and get as much out of these places as possible for the benefit of those who are doing it, the colonizing powers. But this is how things work out. You can't always have everything your own way. Sometimes you do something which is intended just for your benefit, but others also benefit. Now, it so happened that the great advance, I mentioned in particular medical knowledge, that the great advance that was made in medical knowledge happened largely in Europe and in the West, in that period of about 80, 100 years or so. So when colonial authorities have gone arrived in various parts of the non-European world, and everybody's, still ignorant about so many of the diseases that we now know so much about, malaria, cholera, all these epidemic diseases, and they had already started with the solutions. So suddenly it seemed like a miracle that these people could provide knowledge of this kind. But I repeat that yes, we have to acknowledge that these things came our way, but they came as part of other things, which perhaps we did not necessarily need.
Should we have a question further back? Because I think they often don't get a chance. There's a man up there who's come up.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful talk. Sir, recently, I'm from Gulistan and I'm doing BS English Literature from Punjab University. So recently, I am also doing thesis on your novel Afterlife. It was recently published into Telepenny. So in that novel, I'm very confused about a novel about a character that is Hamza. Because as we all know about colonization and the horror consequences of colonization on India as well on other colonial areas. So in this novel, the attachment of Hamza with that, my question is especially from you, sir. So that in this novel there the character Hamza, so when he joins that German colonial troops, so over there, as you have mentioned in your novel that, as you mentioned in your novel about the connection of Hamza and that German colonizer. So my question is this: that is there any human connection? You have tried to mention a human connection between Hamza and that German colonizer, or you have simply mentioned that the German colonizers their basic purpose is to educate. As you know that as Rudyard Kipling used a phrase, "white man's burden." They have come to educate colonizers. So I want that you have to put light on this connection of Hamza and that German colonizers. This is my question.
Gosh, you tortured yourself there. Let me see if I can extract at least a thread out of that. I think you're referring to the relationship between the German officer and Hamza. And my thinking there, at least that's a thread I want to pull out of what you said. My thinking was, and it wasn't just about colonialism, but it's about, or rather what I was thinking of was that people who are in the service of an ideology which might be oppressive, it might be colonialism, it might be other things, but people who are in the service of that, either say as army officers, police officers, whatever, do not always subscribe fully to the ideology that they're serving, but they are part of the society. They have to carry out these things in order to belong to that society. It may be they have doubts which they have to learn to suppress, or maybe they don't have doubts at all, but they simply have intimations or feelings that there is something not quite right about doing what we have to do. So I don't know how many such people there might be, let's say in a battalion of soldiers or something like that, but I'm guessing there will be some. So my officer is one of those, somebody that I'm thinking he will have had some uncertainties about the purpose, or rather what he is there to do. But this cannot be admitted, because to admit is to be self-treacherous, to say, I don't belong here, I'm doing the wrong thing. And to say that is even harder than to suppress that knowledge, to know it but not to admit to it. So it's that kind of dilemma, I suppose, not acknowledged, that I have given to this officer. That he doesn't know, and the pastor as well, that there is some doubt, but it's not admitted, but nonetheless, it's kind of assuaged in a way by doing kind acts now and then. And this makes it seem as if, I'm not a cruel person after all. Okay? I don't know if that kind of addresses something that you're
We are nearly out of time. Okay, the microphone's with someone there. And then maybe one more question, and I'd like to have a woman asking the question next. Okay, good.
My question is for Nadifa. It was mentioned earlier that the two main contextual facets of your writing are, like, the first is the grandiose, more big picture, historical status quo of the time, and the second is the more intimate details of the characters in your book. So I just wanted to ask, is the process of intertwining and sort of like coalescing the two, is that a natural process for a writer, or is that something you need to make a conscious effort to sort of like intertwine in the writing of your novel?
I think it really depends on the writer. Probably all have a different relationship to facts and fiction, and where we draw the line and how we work our way between them. But for me, I feel as if, especially in the last novel with the Fortune Men, I got to the point where it was really difficult for me to work out and remember what I'd made up and what was actually from some research, whether my own interviews with people or from the archives. And that's where I do want to be. I want to forget and to feel so completely immersed in the story that, I tend to not make things up. I try and follow the facts as much as possible, and then I step in when I have to. But then also the way that something is written that's for me where fiction really lies, is how you communicate the story. And yeah, I like it when it feels as if it's an instinctive, almost subconscious work.
Thank you. So we have our last question, and I'm happy to say it's from a woman. Here we are. Yes.
I was just wondering, in the same way you said that unless you've had that experience yourself, for instance, of being on write for the other gender, for an experience that you cannot have had? How do you process that as writers of fiction?
Yeah, I don't know. I think men have been writing about women for a very long time, so I tend not to fret very much if I occasionally write from the point of view of a male character.
Thank you. I think we've got to the end now. It's bang on 6 o'clock, and And I just wanted to say thank you all very much for being here, but most of all, thank you so much to this wonderful panel of writers. Thank you.
It is going to have Mr. Ahmed say a few words, please. Thank you. You can have your attention.
On behalf of the Law Literary Festival, I thank all of you